My mother always introduced my cousin as the doctor and me as just the nurse. She didn't use the word just when she was screaming for someone to save my grandfather's life. There is a terrifying, profound moment when the lights go out, the phone lines die, and the people who spent years mocking your existence suddenly realize you are their only remaining tether to survival. For my entire adult life, I have been an afterthought in my own family. I am a trauma nurse. I work in the emergency room, spending 12-hour shifts knee-deep in the chaotic, fragile reality of human mortality. I see people on the absolute worst days of their lives, and I pull them back from the edge of the abyss. But to my family, I was simply the girl who changed bedpans. I was the one who didn't quite have the ambition to go all the way. I was the one who settled. My cousin Julian did not settle. Julian is a cosmetic dermatologist with a private practice in a very affluent district. Julian drives a car that costs more than my house, wears bespoke suits, and has a Rolex that catches the light whenever he reaches for his crystal wine glass. He is the golden child, the pinnacle of our family's deeply entrenched hierarchy of status and perceived success. He has a pristine clinical setup filled with soft music, ambient lighting, and patients whose greatest medical emergencies involve uneven pigmentation or the subtle, creeping signs of aging. He is a doctor. And in my mother's eyes, in my grandfather's eyes, that title elevated him to a plane of existence I could never hope to touch. I had trauma shears and medical tape. I had tired eyes and a uniform that often smelled of iodine and bleach. I lived in the gritty, unglamorous trenches of real medicine, while Julian floated above it all in a sterilized bubble of aesthetic perfection. But there is something they don't teach you when you are building a life based entirely on appearances. They don't teach you what to do when the veneer cracks. They don't teach you how to handle the raw, violent reality of a human body failing in real time. Guess which of our skill sets mattered at 2 in the morning, trapped in a snowstorm, entirely cut off from the rest of the world? It was supposed to be a celebration. My grandfather, the stoic and exacting patriarch of our family, had summoned us all to his remote, sprawling cabin high in the mountains for his 80th birthday. This wasn't a rustic shack. It was an expansive, timber-framed estate, isolated by miles of winding, treacherous roads, surrounded by ancient pines and jagged peaks. It was beautiful, but it was profoundly unforgiving. As we arrived, the sky was already bruised with the heavy, dark purple of an impending winter storm. The air was bitterly cold, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones and makes the world feel incredibly small. From the moment I walked through the heavy oak doors, the dynamic was established. It was a familiar, deeply worn groove that we all slipped into effortlessly. Julian was greeted with warm embraces, eager questions about his expanding clinic, and a glass of 20-year-old scotch. I was greeted with a tight smile from my mother and a dismissive pat on the shoulder from my grandfather. During dinner, the conversation naturally revolved around Julian's accomplishments. My mother, with her practiced, elegant cruelty, made sure to highlight the contrast. Julian is expanding into laser therapies, she announced to the table, her eyes gleaming with pride. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to me. And Claire, are you still working those awful night shifts? It must be so exhausting, dear, dealing with all that unpleasantness. Have you given any more thought to going back to school for a real degree? Nursing administration, perhaps, something less messy? I sat there cutting my food with precise mechanical motions, feeling the familiar burn of humiliation settling in my chest. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. Over the years, I had learned that my words held no currency in this house. I simply nodded, swallowed the indignity, and offered a polite, noncommittal answer. I watched Julian smile, a sympathetic, condescending tilt of his head that suggested he pitied me. I watched my grandfather nod in agreement with my mother, valuing the visible prestige of Julian's wealth over the invisible, grinding labor of my profession. They saw my restraint as weakness. They saw my silence as an admission of inferiority. They had no idea that my silence was born from discipline. When you spend your life managing chaos, you learn to conserve your energy. You learn not to engage in petty skirmishes when you are trained for war. The storm hit with a sudden, violent intensity shortly after midnight. The wind howled against the heavy glass windows, sounding like a physical entity trying to tear the structure apart. The temperature plummeted. And then, with a sharp, echoing crack that resonated through the timber framing, the power grid failed. The estate was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The hum of the central heating died, the ambient light from the modern fixtures vanished. At first, it was just an inconvenience. My mother complained about the chill. Julian laughed, a nervous, hollow sound, and pulled out his phone to use the flashlight, suggesting we open another bottle of wine and wait for the backup generator to kick in. But the generator didn't kick in. The silence in the house grew heavy, oppressive. And then, from the hallway leading to the master suite, a sound shattered the quiet. It wasn't a cry for help. It was a heavy, dead weight hitting the hardwood floor. It was the sound of a body collapsing with no attempt to catch itself. I moved before I consciously registered the decision. It is muscle memory, a deeply ingrained biological response forged in the crucible of the trauma bay. I sprinted down the hall, my bare feet slapping against the cold wood, the weak beam of my phone cutting through the dark. I found my grandfather on the floor. He was crumpled, twisted at an unnatural angle, clutching his chest with white-knuckled desperation. His eyes were wide, rolling back, filled with a primal, suffocating terror. His skin, even in the dim light of my phone, was a ghastly, mottled gray. He was gasping, short, wet, desperate pulls of air that did nothing to fill his lungs. My mother and Julian arrived seconds later. The beam of Julian's phone illuminated the scene, and immediately the air was sucked out of the room. My mother began to scream. It was a high, piercing sound of pure, unadulterated panic. She fell to her knees, grabbing my grandfather's face, shaking him, crying out his name in a hysterical loop. "Arthur, Dad, what's happening? Somebody do something. Julian, do something. You're a doctor. Help him." I looked at Julian. He was frozen. He was standing perfectly still, his expensive sweater suddenly looking absurdly out of place, staring at the dying man on the floor with an expression of absolute horror. The golden child, the man whose hands were insured for millions, the man who spent his days delicately injecting fillers into perfectly sanitized skin, was paralyzed. He had no protocol for this. He had no sterile environment, no assisting nurses, no crash cart, no monitor. He was staring at a massive, catastrophic widowmaker heart attack, and he was completely, utterly useless. He took a half step backward, his breathing shallow, his hands trembling. "Julian," my mother shrieked, her voice tearing at the edges. "Help him." Julian's mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked at me, his eyes wide and terrified, silently begging to be saved from the reality of the moment. The hierarchy of our family, the decades of carefully constructed status, dissolved in a fraction of a second. The illusion of his superiority shattered against the hard, unforgiving floor of the cabin. "Move," I said. My voice was low, flat, and completely devoid of emotion. It was the voice I used when a multiple vehicle pileup rolled through the ER doors. I physically shoved my mother out of the way. She stumbled back, shocked, but I didn't have time to care about her feelings. I dropped to my knees beside my grandfather, 2 fingers to the carotid artery. The pulse was there, but it was thready, rapid, and incredibly weak. It felt like a dying moth fluttering beneath his skin. His airway was partially obstructed by the angle of his neck. I tilted his head back, thrusting his jaw forward to open the airway. "Listen to me," I barked, my voice cutting through the panic like a scalpel. "The power is out, the roads are blocked by the storm, and we have no landline. Julian, check your cell for a signal. Now." Julian fumbled with his phone, his hands shaking so violently he almost dropped it. "Nothing," he stammered, his voice thin and fragile. "No service, nothing." "Mother," I snapped, refusing to let her spiral back into hysterics. "Go to my bags in the guest room. I have a trauma kit in the bottom of my duffel. Bring it here. Bring every blanket you can find. Go." She scrambled to her feet, the authority in my voice compelling her to obey without question. I turned my attention back to my grandfather. He was diaphoretic, sweating profusely despite the freezing temperature of the room. He was experiencing cardiogenic shock. His heart was failing, unable to pump enough blood to sustain his organs. Without immediate intervention, without a cath lab, without heparin or nitroglycerin, he was going to die on this floor. I had to work with what I had. I needed to reduce the workload on his heart. "Julian," I said, not looking up, "I need aspirin. Go to the bathrooms, empty every cabinet, find aspirin, not Tylenol, not ibuprofen, aspirin, now." Julian nodded dumbly and ran. I stayed with my grandfather. He gripped my wrist, his nails digging into my skin with terrifying strength. He was looking at me, really looking at me, perhaps for the first time in my life. The judgment was gone from his eyes. The stern disappointment was gone. All that remained was fear and a desperate, pleading reliance. "Claire," he wheezed, his voice a broken rattle. "I'm right here, Arthur," I said, my tone steady, projecting an absolute calm I did not fully feel. "You're having a heart attack. I am going to keep you here. Do not try to speak. Conserve your energy. Breathe with me." My mother returned, dumping my heavy trauma bag onto the floor along with a pile of wool blankets. Julian arrived seconds later, clutching a small, half-empty bottle of aspirin. "Chew these," I instructed my grandfather, pulling 4 tablets from the bottle and forcing them between his lips. "Do not swallow them whole, chew them, it will thin your blood." I opened my kit. It wasn't a hospital crash cart, but it was a comprehensive field trauma bag I always kept in my car, transferred to my luggage for the trip. I pulled out my stethoscope, slamming the earpieces into my ears. I listened to his chest, muffled heart sounds, fluid backing up into the lungs. It was bad, it was incredibly bad. I needed to keep his blood pressure up, but not so high that it ruptured an ischemic vessel. I needed to keep him warm to prevent hypothermia from accelerating the shock. "Help me lift him," I ordered Julian. "We need to elevate his head and shoulders to ease the strain on his lungs. Mother, pack the blankets around him, keep his core warm." For the next 6 hours, time ceased to exist in any normal capacity. The world shrank to the size of that dark hallway, illuminated only by the fading batteries of our phones. I became a machine, operating on pure, unadulterated instinct and years of grueling, unacknowledged training. I monitored his pulse constantly, feeling the rhythm dance dangerously close to ventricular fibrillation. I tracked his respirations. I kept him calm. When he started to slip into unconsciousness, I sternal rubbed him, grinding my knuckles into his chest to force him back to reality through sheer pain. Julian sat against the wall, his knees pulled to his chest, watching me. He didn't speak. He didn't offer medical advice. He simply watched the cousin he had silently patronized for a decade hold the line between life and death with bare hands and sheer force of will. My mother knelt on the other side of my grandfather, weeping silently, handing me gauze, tape, or water whenever I snapped an order. The psychological tension in the room was thicker than the freezing air. Every labored breath my grandfather took felt like a ticking clock. I was fighting a war without weapons. I was using gravity, aspirin, and psychological anchoring to treat a massive myocardial infarction. But I did not panic, I did not falter. In the ER, you learn that panic is a luxury you cannot afford. You lock your emotions in a heavy iron box and you do the work. You focus on the physiology, you focus on the mechanics of survival. Around 4 in the morning, my grandfather's pulse fluttered, dropped, and then vanished. His eyes rolled back, his breathing stopped. "He's gone." My mother screamed, lunging forward. "Get back!" I roared, throwing her off him. I straddled his chest. I didn't think. I interlaced my fingers, locked my elbows, and threw the entire weight of my body into his sternum. 1, 2, 3, 4. The sound of his ribs cracking beneath the force of my compressions echoed sharply in the silent hallway. My mother gasped, a sound of pure horror, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I pushed hard and fast, forcing his heart to pump, forcing blood to his brain. "Julian." I shouted, breathless, "Get over here. When I fatigue, you take over compressions. 2 inches deep, 100 beats a minute, watch my hands." Julian scrambled over, his eyes wide, nodding frantically. I pushed until my shoulders burned, until my lungs screamed for air, 30 compressions. Then 2 breaths, over and over, 10 minutes passed, 10 minutes of brutal, violent, life-saving physical labor, and then beneath my hands I felt a stutter, a resistance. My grandfather gasped, a harsh, ragged intake of air, and his eyes fluttered open. I slumped back, my chest heaving, sweat dripping down my face despite the freezing cold. I grabbed his wrist. The pulse was back, rapid, chaotic, but there. "Do not ever do that again," I whispered to him, my voice trembling for the first time that night. By the time the pale, gray light of dawn began to creep through the windows, the storm had broken. We were sitting in absolute silence. My grandfather was stabilized, exhausted, but breathing on his own. I was sitting cross-legged on the floor next to him, my hands stained with a mixture of sweat and the dust from the floorboards. Around 7 in the morning, the heavy thudding rhythm of helicopter rotors vibrated through the cabin walls. The medevac we couldn't call had been dispatched by the local authorities when the power grid went down, performing welfare checks on remote properties. When the flight paramedics breached the door, swarming into the hallway with heavy gear, oxygen tanks, and a portable ECG monitor, they took one look at the scene. They saw the positioning, the chewed aspirin residue, the blankets, the sheer, controlled exhaustion in my posture. The lead medic hooked up the leads to my grandfather's chest, staring at the monitor. He looked up at Julian, seeing the expensive clothes, the pristine appearance. "You a doctor, man? You do this?" Julian swallowed hard. He looked at the medic, then looked down at his hands, perfectly clean, completely unscarred. He slowly turned his head and looked at me. "No," Julian said, his voice cracking, entirely devoid of his usual arrogance. "I'm a dermatologist. She did this. She's a trauma nurse." The medic looked at me, taking in my disheveled uniform, my exhausted eyes, the undeniable presence of someone who commanded the space. He gave me a slow, deeply respectful nod. You held him together through a widowmaker for 6 hours in the dark without a crash cart? He asked. I kept him breathing, I replied quietly. You saved his life, nurse. That's a hell of a save, the medic said, turning back to his team. All right, let's package him up. We need to fly. In the ER, we don't care about your ego. We only care if you have a pulse. They loaded my grandfather onto the stretcher. As they wheeled him past my mother, she reached out and grabbed my arm. Her grip was tight, desperate. She looked at me, her eyes swollen, the condescension entirely burned away, replaced by a profound, earth-shattering realization of what she had almost lost, and exactly who had prevented it. She opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps apologize, to perhaps finally acknowledge the weight of what I do. But she couldn't find the words. The vocabulary of our family didn't have the capacity for that kind of admission. I gently removed her hand from my arm. I didn't smile. I didn't offer comfort. I simply picked up my trauma bag, zipped it shut, and walked out the door behind the stretcher. The family dynamic never recovered. The hierarchy was permanently, irrevocably shattered. Julian returned to his clinic, but he never spoke of his prestige at the dinner table again. My grandfather survived, and though he remained a quiet, stern man, the way he looked at me changed forever. There was no more talk of just a nurse. There were no more suggestions about finding a less messy career. They stopped asking when I was going back to school for a real degree. Silence, I learned, is the loudest apology. To all the nurses, the medical support staff, the first responders watching this, how many times has a family member minimized your absolute expertise? How many times have you been treated as an accessory by people who would completely fall apart the second real life hits? You are the invisible spine of the medical world. I want you to go down into the comments right now and tell your story. Vent in the comments. Has your family ever idolized a golden child who folded when the pressure was on? We want to read your stories. Do not let your labor remain invisible. Speak up.